Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are tuning in from, and welcome to Eval Cafe. My name is John Akwete. I am the coordinator of Eval Cafe here at the Evaluation Center of Western Michigan University, and I'll be your host for today. Though we are tuning in virtually, we would like to recognize that Western Michigan University is located on land historically occupied by Ijawi, Odawa, and Boduwami nations. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor this ancestral land of the Three Fire Confederacy and consider the sacred land of all indigenous people and their continuous presence, especially wherever you may be tuning in from. The Evaluation Cafe is a weekly series presented throughout the academic year that features guest speakers on a wide range of evaluation topics, and as evident in all our presentations last semester, and has been taking place at the Evaluation Center since the early 1980s. Though this has traditionally been a small in-person gathering that have been recorded and shared online continuously from last semester, this spring 2022 speaker series will, while some may be hybrid, all events will be open to the public to join online regardless of location. For our fifth event this semester, we are delighted to be joined by a distinguished girl, Dr. Dana Wanzer. Dr. Wanzer is an assistant professor of psychology and evaluation at the University of Wisconsin-Stout. Before handing over to our guests, for those new to Eval Cafe, we typically have a 30 to 40 minute presentation followed by 15 to 20 minute Q&A. Like our previous event, our guests has requested that participants submit their questions in the chat box at any point, so she can pause every few minutes to feed those questions from the audience. At this moment, I'd like to invite Dr. Wanzer to share any pertinent information about herself and continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Yeah, give me a second. I'll get set up, share my screen. I got the chat open, so if anybody wants to ask any questions throughout the presentation, more than happy to, stop and answer any questions as they arise. So thank you for the Latin acknowledgement from where you are all located in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I am talking to you today from the stolen lands of the Anishinaabe people in a place that is known as Menominee, Wisconsin. I do also encourage you to discover the native lands that you reside on, support Indigenous organizations with your time and money as you can, and help in the commitment to restoring lands back to Indigenous people. I'm going to skip over this because you did a great job of introducing me. I teach evaluation to graduate students in our MS in Applied Psychology program. I also teach statistics, research methods, interpersonal skills, and so on. I conduct evaluations primarily with youth programs, doing things like after-school program evaluation and stuff like that. But I'm at a teaching university, so most of my time is spent teaching and supervising students in their evaluation work. But I also like to do a lot of research on evaluation, which is kind of why I'm here today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of my past research published in the American Journal of Evaluation that starts to probe into this kind of definitional problem that we face in our field. So my agenda for today is to talk about a little bit about like what is evaluation and some of the definitions that exist in the world on evaluation. Talk a little bit about how evaluation differs from research or not, and then how we might combine the two. Like I said, I do research on evaluation, and so like, what the heck is that in terms of thinking of the definitional problem of evaluation versus research as well. So starting off with what is evaluation? So this definitional problem of like defining our field has been around for decades. And so this comes from Carter in 1971. And he talks about how in his little section of definition of evaluation research that while most applied social scientists agree on the need for program evaluation, in practice, there's little consensus as to the essential characteristics of such research, that we don't really have a set definition because it's a very wide-ranging practice. So before I go into some of the definitions that do exist, I'd like you to just think to yourself for a moment. How would you define program evaluation? So I'll give you a few seconds to just noodle on that question for a second. What are some of the key characteristics that come up in your definition for evaluation? So keep that definition in mind. Yeah, you are more than happy to live tweet and do screen captures. I will also share slides at the end of this once I'll save it as a PDF and upload those as well. So feel free to share as much as you'd like. One of our earliest definitions comes from Daniel Stufflebeam, who said that evaluation is the process of delineating, obtaining, and providing useful information for judging decision alternatives. What's funny about this definition and what Tina Christie talks about in a later article is the story behind this definition and this definition from Scriven. So shortly after Stufflebeam's definition, Michael Scriven came out with his own definition in his book on the logic of evaluation. In it, he defined evaluation the way that most of the field has come to define it, as this systematic determination of the merit, worth, or significance or something. But he also added, when he wrote this definition, that, quote, "What evaluation is used for is another matter." So whereas Stufflebeam's definition really focused on this kind of use piece of evaluation, Scriven really focused more on this kind of systematic inquiry approach, this methodological approach, as well as the key component of valuing in this process of determining that merit, worth, and significance. And so a lot of the definitions have some sort of combination of these three components, of this use component, methods component, valuing component. And so we saw two definitions that took one or two of these, but I like this particular definition because it actually combines all three really nicely. So this comes from Michael Quinn Patton in his book on qualitative research and evaluation. And he defines evaluation as the systematic collection of information about the activities, characteristics, and outcomes of programs to make judgments about programs. So there's that valuing piece. Improve program effectiveness and or inform decision makings about future programming. And there's that use piece with that methods piece at the beginning. And so to really examine this definitional problem, we could go about it in two different ways. And Amy Gullickson did it in kind of the opposite way of trying to think, okay, here's what evaluation should look like in her article on, let's see, what is it called? Something about the elephant, like looking at the whole elephant. And it really expands Scriven's logic of evaluation and does a really good job. Yeah, the whole elephant does a really good job of like further expanding Scriven's initial work on this and really trying to solidify a better definition for the field. I came at this at a very different angle, really thinking about, well, how are people currently defining evaluation? And specifically, how do evaluators and non-evaluators, in this case, researchers, define evaluation? And so I collected data from members of the American Evaluation Association, as well as members of the American Educational Research Association, focusing primarily on a couple of their divisions and SIGs, kind of like our TIGs in AEA, that were really more evaluation focused. I invited over 2,000 people to participate, and here's the participation rates as well as the completion rates. I also invited people through social media and had another 55 people who participated and completed the study as a result of that, for a grand total of participants of 520. And so the first thing I asked people was just, do you consider yourself primarily an evaluator or a researcher? And I had a nice even split on this, with about 50% saying they were evaluators and 50% saying they were researchers. My initial question coming to this research was just, how do evaluators and research define evaluation? What are some of those key components of their definitions? And so I asked them to just give me their definition, and I coded that into a variety of codes. And so overall, I found that most participants did believe that evaluation was about that valuing component, providing a value judgment, with about 84% of people providing that as part of their definition. After that, about half of participants focused on the methods, the systematic inquiry component of their definition. And then lastly, a third of participants thought it was about that evaluation is for decision-making, for program improvement, that use piece that we saw in Stufflebeam's definition. A key component here, though, is that there was actually a big difference in this third one on this use component, where evaluators were more likely to think that evaluation was for decision-making compared to researchers, with about 40% of evaluators saying evaluation is for decision-making, use, and so on, and about 26% of researchers saying that. And I want to pause here because I think it's really important to note that of the definitions I've pulled, of the research that's being conducted, they are all the definitions are from white guys, and all the research is taking place in the United States. And clearly the United States is a very small part of the larger world. And so further research really is needed to look at this at a more global, expansive look at this. So I'm hoping someday somebody will do this, maybe myself if I can find the time. In the meantime, I did kind of less empirically examine this question by talking to a number of evaluators from around the world in a short series on my podcast, Evaluland. And so I asked people from these 4 areas of the local evaluation groups, from Latin America and Caribbean, from North Africa and Middle East, and so on, to participate and tell me a little bit about what evaluation looks like in their contexts. So a little bit of work in this area, but definitely a lot more empirical work is needed to look at this more globally. And it would be really nice if I could just stop here and just say, here is the definition of evaluation as a result of the research, as a result of, empirical examination. But because of the fact that evaluation is so eclectic, pluralistic, and mixed, I don't think that's really ever going to be possible. It would be nice. It would really help us in communicating what evaluation is, but I think it's a definitional problem because it's supposed to be. It makes it really difficult for us, but at the same time, there's a worry that if we try to come together to one single definition, that it might exclude other, maybe more fringe definitions and practices of evaluation. So we could talk more about that. I'd love to talk more about it, but unfortunately, I'm just going to murk up the waters a little bit more than I'm going to make things clearer for folks in this presentation. That's why we're focusing on definitional problems as opposed to solutions. So we've gone over some of the definitional problems with defining evaluation. So now I want to turn into thinking about how do we differentiate evaluation from research? And I focused on research because when I was coming into grad school, quite some time ago now, I was really I had a hard time trying to think about what is the difference between the two? Why am I getting this co-concentration in evaluation? What really, how can I make this clear for myself? So that was really the original impetus for this study, was to make things clear for myself of what are the differences between the two. And part of the reason why I wrote this paper as well. And in fact, one of our earliest definitions from 68, comes from, and you're going to have to forgive me because I've actually only ever read his name and I don't recall ever hearing it pronounced, but I think it's Edward Suckman. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Defined evaluation in this way: that evaluation applies the methods of science to action programs in order to obtain objective and valid measures of what such programs are accomplishing. And I bring up this definition because I think of this as really kind of aligned with this perspective that evaluation is applied research. And a lot of people do kind of define and describe evaluation in this way, that evaluation is applied research that does maybe something a little different. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how we might differentiate evaluation from research. This is also what I brought up to my research participants. So I'd ask them first, how do you define evaluation? Then I asked them open-endedly, how do you differentiate evaluation from research? And based on that, then I asked them, of these 5 different ways of thinking about how you might differentiate evaluation from research, which one best matches your definition? And so I'd like you to also think to yourself for a second, how might you define and differentiate program evaluation from social science research? What are the things that are similar and different between program evaluation and social science research? What comes up for you? So just think to yourself for a minute. One of the best ways that we can kind of think about this, it came out, now over a decade ago, but is still really commonly used to help differentiate the two for us, is this hourglass figure that comes from both Hallie Preskill and John Lavelle in 2010. And so they use this to kind of talk about the process of evaluation, where things at the beginning of the process tends to look a little different. It looks pretty similar in kind of the midst of the whole project, in the middle of it, of the methods and the analysis and designs, like they can look pretty similar from research and evaluation. But then they differ again at the end in terms of what you do after the study is over. So some of the things that, at least from this, that people have said are different are things like the purpose. Research is for generating new knowledge. And this is where our definition of research comes from for federally funded or for things that go through IRB here in the United States. Our definition of research, and therefore going through IRB, is that there's collecting data for the purpose of seeking and for the purpose of generating new knowledge. Whereas evaluation might be for that, but more importantly, it's usually used for informing decision-making, making program improvements, and so on. Research tends to be kind of driven by the researcher themselves, whereas evaluation, the stakeholders have a lot of key voice in that the process of doing this research. And at the end, whereas research tends to be published in some sort of peer-reviewed manuscript literature base of some sort, evaluation tends not to be published. It's produced into a final report given to stakeholders. And so again, beginning and end tend to look a little different, but the middle is a little similar. So this hourglass figure is pretty similar to viewing research and evaluation as like an overlapping Venn diagram. They have their differences, that's the blue and the yellow region, but there's also some similarities in that green component, where the green might be the things like the design methods, statistical analyses, and so on. But not everyone views research this way. And so some also think of it more of a continuum, that different aspects of the inquiry approach could be more evaluation-like or more research-like. Similarly, some just think of evaluation as a form of research, it's a type of applied research, most often as like an RCT, a randomized control trial, or a quasi-experimental design, with the purpose of evaluation being for like determining causal impacts of a program. I see this a lot in terms of like the economics approach to evaluation, of thinking of evaluation as a method that researchers use as opposed to its own field. Some don't see any difference between the two, that research and evaluation are one and the same. And then lastly, Scriven has advocated for the position that evaluation is a transdiscipline that provides tools and resources to other fields like research. And so we might visualize it like this, where evaluation is the larger circle with the research in it, where evaluation contributes to a lot of other fields, including research. So I'd like you to, in the chat box, tell me which one you think most aligns with how you differentiate research and evaluation. No right or wrong answers here. I have the numbers here. So if you just put a little 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in the chat box, which one best matches yours? How evaluation differs from research? Yeah, so we got mostly 2s. I'm not surprised. I think I'm talking to more evaluators than anything. Somebody's split between 2 and 4. Like, I think I'd like to advocate for 4. I'm not sure if that's necessarily how I personally think of it. We got a couple 1s and a 5. So that kind of matches what we saw in the study. So going back to the study where I asked researchers, like, okay, which of these 5 matches your way of thinking about the differences between the 2? These are the results that I found. where about half of the participants thought research and evaluation intersect, that Venn diagram, that hourglass figure. This matches what you are all saying, most of you are saying, I should say. Whereas about a third thought evaluation was a subcomponent of research, which we had a couple people say that one. We had one person say that they thought it was that continuum, compared to 11% of my sample in my study. And then very few actually thought of it as the other two ways, where the research is a subcomponent of evaluation, again, kind of going back to Scriven's advocacy of evaluation as the trans discipline, the alpha discipline, and then even fewer thought it was that research and evaluation were one and the same. But this is where I'm not surprised of what you all are kind of voting, because evaluators were more likely to believe that they intersect. So 62% thought that they intersected the Venn diagram, the hourglass figure, compared to 22% thought it was evaluation as a subcomponent of research. And we saw kind of a flip with researchers who were more likely to believe that evaluation is a subcomponent of research compared to evaluators. And so my last part of the study was just asking people, okay, if they differ, in what ways do they differ? And so I split it up into, I just kind of pulled from a variety of things that I had seen in the literature and like my understanding of research and evaluation studies to think about a variety of things that could be the way that they differed. And so on all of these different components, which I categorized into kind of like prior to studies being conducted, during studies, at the conclusion of studies, and other kind of related aspects to conducting studies, I asked them to rate it on a 3-point scale. They do not differ, they differ somewhat, and they differ greatly. And so I didn't really ask participants like, how do they differ? So that's a good point for potentially future research, but rather I just asked them, in what capacity do they differ? And so I'm going to walk through these results. And so for prior to studies, half of the participants thought evaluation and research differed greatly in terms of the purpose and the audience. And so this goes back to that hourglass figure. Purpose was another big component of what people thought and how they differed between evaluation and research. And what I think is really interesting is that when we then compare evaluators and researchers, evaluators were actually more likely to believe that they differed in terms of the purpose than researchers. And they were also more likely to believe that they differed in terms of participant involvement. And so we saw some great differences between the two, parts of the sample, evaluators and researchers, in these two capacities that evaluators are really noticing and latching on to the idea of participatory evaluation, or some capacity of participatory evaluation in the work compared to researchers. Just like the hourglass, there weren't many differences perceived from the sample in terms of the kind of like in the middle of the study in terms of design, methods, participants, data collection, and so on. But again, like the hourglass suggested, it did think they differed at the end of the study in terms of providing recommendations, the way of disseminating results, and the generalization of those results. And again, we did see some differences in terms of evaluators think they differed more greatly than researchers in terms of disseminating results. And then in our last little part of just kind of like a smattering of other things that I couldn't fit into those three categories, a third of participants thought they differed in terms of politics and value judgments. And evaluators were more likely to believe they differed greatly in terms of those value judgments. So evaluators are seeing that valuing component more so probably than researchers do. So just to recap kind of the whole study in and of itself, the first finding that was most participants agreed evaluation is about that valuing component or that systematic inquiry methods component, but 40% of evaluators also think it's about decision-making, that use component, compared to only 24% of researchers. Evaluators tended to think that evaluation and research overlap, whereas researchers tend to think evaluation is a subcomponent of research. That they differ most in terms of the purpose, recommendations, dissemination, generalization, and audience. And lastly, that evaluators think evaluation and research differ more greatly than do researchers, which aligns with that kind of the overlapping Venn diagram where evaluators were more likely to believe that's the way we think of the differences between the two compared to evaluation as a subcomponent of research. So I've marked up the waters, right? We don't have a clear definition of what evaluation is. At least I'm not going to provide one for you. We complicate things further when we think about the similarities and differences between evaluation and research. But let's make this even more complicated. And this is where I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on this, of trying to kind of combine the two, because we have all these terms, right, in our field. We have terms like research on evaluation, meta-evaluation, research evaluation, and meta-research. And trying to like conceptualize all of these and define these and operationalize all of these when already the terms research and evaluation are unclear and problematic for a variety of reasons. This just makes it even more complicated, right? And as somebody who is on the leadership team for the research on evaluation TIG, I was just like, how do we make this clearer for folks? How do we communicate what research on evaluation is? How do we advocate for this when it's really hard to define what it is in the first place? And so in trying to think of how all of these kind of fit together, I kind of created this framework of thinking about what is the thing being examined, whether it's evaluation or research, and what is the activity being done, whether you're evaluating or researching. And so putting things into this quadrant, we first have research on evaluation. So this is using the activity of research to look at the thing of evaluation. So we're using more research type approaches to explore and examine things related to evaluation, the field of evaluation, the practice of evaluation, context evaluation is done for the purpose of improving evaluation. Similarly, meta-evaluation is using evaluation as the activity to look at evaluation. So we're evaluating evaluation in this capacity. So we're using that values inquiry approach, that valuing component, to examine past evaluation studies for the purpose of improving evaluation work in that particular context more often than not. That being said, I think these are murky waters, and I know some of you are working on meta evaluation stuff. So like, I'm really curious if like this resonates for you or not. Then we have research evaluation, which is evaluating research products. We're looking at the quality of research products to see like, was that a good study or not? For example, was that effective in terms of how it was done, how it was reported, et cetera. And then lastly, we have meta research, also called research on research, which is using research approaches to look at research. So this is things like examining questionable research practices as a field, the replication crisis stuff going on, open science practices, examining the peer review process, trying to see how statisticians and researchers think about p-values and so on. So these are the 4 areas across that quadrant. Like, I'm curious, so I'm actually going to stop here. This is the end of my presentation. And here's my contact information. But with this in mind, is there anything missing here? Is there other key components that would help us differentiate these components, these 4 things? Is there an added layer that should be added here? I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on the matter. So I'm going to stop here. I'd love, get on microphone, get on the chat box and ask your questions. Yeah, I'm very excited to see all of that forthcoming stuff on meta evaluation, chapter on meta evaluation, systematic review on meta evaluation practice, and yeah, Dr. Corin's dissertation focused on research evaluation. Yeah, and there was I'm trying to think who did it. I was just about to read, I'm working on a paper on open science practices for evaluation, and a bunch of evaluators talked about research evaluation and strategies and best practices for that. I'm blanking on who did it. I can search that if people are interested. But But I like it because a lot of the people doing research evaluation work are really approaching it from a more research methods standpoint, as opposed to we are people in the field of evaluation approaching it from an evaluation standpoint. And I think both are necessary to do this work well. So Brad says, I think the term evaluation of research would be clearer for describing the activity of evaluating research versus research evaluation. That is probably very true. I took the term that I see more often in the literature base as opposed to, but I could do the same thing, like AKA evaluation of research. So, I can make that change pretty quickly.
Dana, I have a question sort of on your larger presentation and scope of research here, if you feel like it.
Please.
I'm really curious to know if your research has turned up anything regarding evaluator views, or maybe even researcher views, on sort of the advocate role. And the reason I ask this question is because I feel like I'm seeing more in the field of evaluation, probably still a minority, but maybe a growing or vocal contingent who holds a view that evaluators also need to be advocates, whether it's advocates for a specific program that they're evaluating or involved in, or sometimes in a broader sense, advocates for certain larger kind of views or social values. And I'm just sort of curious to see if that's an area that you've looked into at all and what you see in terms of trends there.
I have not personally, well, no, I'll take that back. I have not published anything on this. I am working with Bianca Montrose Moorhead and one of her students at UConn on, it's a much broader field inquiry into evaluation, looking at like the identity of evaluators. And one of the questions, two of the questions we ask is, what is your role in advocating for social justice? So not necessarily advocating for evaluation, but like kind of more broadly. And it came up a lot of like their thoughts about advocating in general, and whether they thought that was their role to be an advocate for the program, advocate for social justice, advocate for evaluation. So we're still in the early stages. We're still analyzing data, so I don't really have much to share in that regard, but I think it is really interesting. In a larger sense, stuff that I haven't done, there's a great NDE volume that talks about this. And I'm gonna point to Zach because I bet he could go figure it out for me while I'm like talking right now. But it was a recent one of the last 5 or 10 ones that came out. I think it was sometime last year. And a lot of people investigated that question of like, what is our role in advocacy? And should we be an advocate or not? And there was one in particular I really liked that took a more nuanced approach of not like a yes or no answer, but like, if you're capable, yeah, you should be, as opposed to a yes, no, like you should or shouldn't be. I would also point to our, which framework, the guiding principles for evaluators, that points from the American Evaluation Association, right? And this is an AEA document, but that also says that part of our role as evaluators is to advocate for our field. And so I think it is important that we do that. The way we can go about it can be very diverse and eclectic as well, but I think it is important that we advocate. And I think this is one way I'm doing it, by trying to help communicate what evaluation is to evaluators and non-evaluators.
Thank you. Yeah, that all makes sense. But you haven't looked at it enough to see if this is really a trend. So I'm always sort of curious, like, gee, I have a perception that it's sort of a growth trend. I'm never sure if that's just my perception or if that's sort of a solid thing, that there's like a generational shift in evaluation going on.
Yeah, well, very few of us are doing longitudinal research that would actually be able to look at a trend, right? I perceive the same thing though, but that's again also just like my perspective as well. I'm catching up with the chat now. So Lori says this table makes sense. Do you think it will help incoming graduate students in evaluation? I hope so. I've heard that, like, I mean, I use my paper, I use it selfishly to, you know, to help my students learn what evaluation is and how it differs from research. It's one of my earliest things that I assigned for them to read. This table is really new for me. I've only kind of had it recently, so I'm hoping it might be helpful in helping describe it, but they tend to use, like, the paper itself seems to be really helpful for them in terms of at least getting the differences, distinctions between research and evaluation. And I know other folks are also using the paper in their coursework and also finding it useful. So, you know, perhaps this is something that could be like a nice MTurk study to see if people could, you know, understand the differences and describe evaluation well as a result of, like, maybe a quick little presentation or write-up of the paper. Be interesting to examine. Interesting. So Zach talks about a distinction between practical, conceptual, and ascriptive meta-evaluation. And the latter two are a bit blurrier between meta-evaluation and ROE. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to reading it. I know you sent me a draft, but I need to, like, actually, I'll wait for the full thing, but I'm excited for it. I'm not an evaluator, but would like to know more about this work because increasingly evaluation is being asked for to see the effectiveness of education programs. In our university, we have a Center for Program Evaluation. I'm curious to know if program evaluation is different. So program evaluation is a type of, it's evaluation in the context of working with programs. So Scriven talks about the 7 Ps, right? And Zach talks about next that as well, that evaluation of projects, products, portfolios, personnel, programs, and I'm missing 1 or 2, but a variety of things that can be evaluated, of which programs are one of them. And that's just what I tend to focus on. And yeah, that's what Zach mentions as well. Yeah, product evaluation mentioned a lot in terms of the what's that like book, the website that you can go to check, like, ratings. I'm blanking on it, but he talks a lot about that in terms of product evaluation. Yeah, consumer reports, basically. Yeah, I think that's the name. Another consideration is that some research and evaluation takes the form of meta-evaluation. Yeah, and that's where I think the blurring between these two is, well, I mean, research and evaluation is blurred as well, right? When we think about, like, action research or community-based participatory research, like, those have a lot of blending with evaluation as well. And so as much as I think this might be helpful, there's nuances that aren't necessarily captured here, and overlap that is hard to make clear to folks. Yep, exactly. So like Corinne's 2017 article with folks at Western Michigan, looking at the meta-analysis as a meta-analysis of research on research is meta research on evaluation, right? And so it's like meta research on evaluation. And yeah, that just further complicates things. And then we could get, like, the meta can go up, but we're not going to talk about Facebook or anything today. Yeah, the way I think of the definition or the differences between meta evaluation and evidence syntheses and evidence gap maps is that a lot of, like, well, first, kind of backing up, like, we've got systematic reviews, in which case I don't think the purpose is really to come to any evaluative or even meta-analysis type of conclusion. It's just like, what is the scope of the literature? So we've got systematic review in that regard. And then we have meta-analysis on top of that to combine the stuff in a more quantitative way. And then if we're adding an evaluative component, then I would think of that more as a meta-evaluation. That's at least the way I think of it, but I would also defer to Zach. Zach and you all at Western Michigan, I think more of in terms of meta-evaluation. I don't do that work personally. Yeah, which I think what I just said matches kind of what Zach just said. Other questions, comments, complaints, whatever? We've got 20 more minutes. I'd love to chat more. Thank you, Sarah. I love when I have time to put together pretty slides. Ooh. Other definitional problems in our field. I feel like the definitional problem of like collaborative participatory empowerment evaluation has been resolved fairly nicely, of thinking about kind of who has kind of the control / power in the evaluation approach. Is kind of the deciding factor between the three. So if the evaluators decide most of the things, but then bring in the stakeholders a bit of the way to help inform the evaluation, that's collaborative. If they work together to do the evaluation, it's participatory. And if the evaluator kind of works with the stakeholders for them to do the evaluation themselves, then it's empowerment. And so I feel like that one's been resolved a bit, but I know that was more of an issue trying to define it. And that latest book that Sage just published, I think helps with that clarification. I'm trying to think what else. I mean, the fact that we have the glossary and stuff helps a lot. And the evaluation thesaurus helps a lot. I kind of feel like the thing that we're coming to terms with right now as a field is more identity-based, of like, who are we as evaluators? How do we situate ourselves amongst non-evaluators and other fields like research, particularly when we're not as well known as researchers are, for example. Thinking about the identity issues related to race and sexuality and how that plays into our roles as evaluators and the programs we work with, and diversity and equity issues is related to all of that. So I see more identity issues than definitional ones right now. Oh yeah, with the professionalization period looming as a result of all of that, yeah, which I think is why the identity stuff is coming up so much, because now that we have our competencies, like it's much more in the forefront. We have a professionalization task force that, may or may not lead to some sort of credentialing. I don't think anything's decided or anything, but it's a clear next step. So do you think research views on what evaluation is have changed? Maybe. I'd like to think so. I think it's a great question, but I also talked to a number of people who are in academia, so presumably around a lot of researchers, and who have a very hard time advocating for the work they do in evaluation amongst their colleagues. That, our journals are all very more practice oriented, and so we don't have the greatest impact factors. And so it looks like we're not doing great work if we're doing research and publishing it. That a lot of our work is evaluation and is published as such. And so it's not recognized in the same capacity as a peer-reviewed publication. And that has led to a lot of tenure problems that I've seen from colleagues, a lot of communication problems, identity problems of like, where should our evaluation center be housed in a university? How do we advocate for the work that we do? And how do we work in my case, in a university that says they like interdisciplinary work and transdisciplinary work, but when you try to propose a course that's going to be transdisciplinary, it's not received well from other departments, right? So yeah, sorry, I don't mean to burst bubbles today. Have you seen any issues with evaluators attempting research or researchers attempting evaluation? I'm going to tackle the second one first because I've seen that a lot. Back at Claremont, when I was working under Tiffany Berry in her evaluation lab, we would actually get a lot of evaluation work because the client originally got a contract with a researcher and then were sorely disappointed that they didn't know how to work with them as a client. And so that happens a lot. And I think some of the issues related to that is that clients may not know how to adequately pay for this work because researchers will find external grants to pay for it as opposed to the clients, or it's built into their research budgets as a university is so they don't have to be charging as much. So I think it also undervalues the work that we do in some capacity. Issues with evaluators attempting research. So this one, a few different things come to mind. One is Michael Harner and a few of us are doing a study looking at how research on evaluation is being done as it's published in conference proposals. And so a lot of the issues we see is a lot of it's just very reflective practice, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not necessarily a systematic inquiry approach. And so thinking about how to help practitioners better, reflective practice could be one way of going about it, but if they want this to be something that's considered research on evaluation, how to be more systematic in that approach is one issue that I see. The other thing is this last little thing right here. I'm hoping to put together a presentation. I think we have a date for April 15th. I think that's a Friday. That like a getting started with research on evaluation presentation. So if you're interested, it'll be posted on Twitter and stuff. Feel free to share at Western Michigan and other folks, but just like getting started, I think is an understanding like frameworks and approaches to a research on evaluation. Hopefully this can be one little starting point. I think it's 12 p.m. Eastern. What issues should we be mindful if we identify as one of these roles, primarily an attempt to do? Oh, yeah, somebody who does both research and evaluation. I guess my thought is like just being clear, like what are you doing and why? Like understanding your purpose of the work. And I don't know what else I would think of in terms of being mindful. I think understanding the differentiation can be helpful, but also the blurring is not a problem. It's just maybe it would be harder to find a home for that in terms of publication. Any other questions? You got 10 more minutes of my time. Let's see. I've got too many studies in the pipeline right now. So doing the study with Bianca Montrose Moorhead and one of our students at UConn on like the identity of evaluators. So this was kind of looking at like what is the definition of evaluation, right? What I've just talked about today. So I think of the next one as kind of like, who are evaluators and how are evaluators different or not from non-evaluators? So that's a large undertaking that we're getting started. We did 40 interviews with evaluators and non-evaluators to get their perspectives on a variety of issues that eventually we'll try to get into a larger survey, but that's one. I mentioned the one with Michael Harner and Seema Mahato and Esther Knowlton and Travis, blanking on his last name right now. He's at Tufts University right now. And we're looking at conference proposals from 2019 and to what extent those are research on evaluation. I'm doing a follow-up to Chris Corrin's 2017 article with the colleagues at Western Michigan and looking at the next 5 years of research on evaluation. So that original article was to 2014. We're adding the next 5 years, 2015 to 2019. I'm hoping to get all the data analyzed this semester and then hopefully write it up and submit, hopefully at JMDE, that kind of follow up 5 years. That's 3. Yeah, too many things. I am doing that kind of just lit review, kind of position piece of how evaluation as a field could benefit from open science practices, but also how open science could benefit from evaluation. And I think this piece right here of the research evaluation stuff is one way that open science could really benefit from the field of evaluation. And then I'm doing I'm again, too many things on my plate, but Olivia Smith, Tiffany Tovey, and I are working very early stages on a book on interpersonal practices for evaluators and professionals and students alike. So, Steve, I'm curious your question there, or your point. There's some value in forcing a choice. I don't know
forcing a choice between research and evaluation. Otherwise, you get 80% of the people saying they do both research and evaluation, and then you're not really ahead of the game, right? So I think the way you did it is, I think, probably the better choice.
Yeah, I mean, for me now, as a result of doing all of this and like thinking about this probably too much, like the distinction is a bit clearer for me. And so, yeah, like my research stuff is research, my evaluation stuff is evaluation. I think there still is that overlap and murkiness in the middle of like action-based research, community-based participatory research, and also from the kind of more evaluation side, like randomized control trials. Yeah, they can be evaluation, but they also can look very much like research, even if it's looking at a program. So there's murkiness there, but I think that clarification and perhaps by forcing a choice could be helpful. Yeah, great point. Could you talk about some of the differences in evaluation definitions across the other global regions? I have not I had a great time, and I encourage you to look at those 4 episodes of the Evalualand podcast to look into that. But I didn't do any kind of synthesis work on my end to try to compare contrast. I also didn't approach it like from a very structured interview approach. And so more work would need to be done, and I have not done that. And I also, as I just listed all the things I'm working on, don't necessarily have the time. I'm also, I mentioned I'm at a teaching university. I also teach 4 classes a semester. So I have a lot on my plate. So help me out and come conduct some research on evaluation. Yeah. Okay, what opportunities are there to continue the conversation? Big difference between evaluative thinking and design thinking. Yeah, I'm actually at like half an hour from now, I'm going to have a conversation with Jan Noga, next episode of the podcast, talking about systems design thinking for evaluation. So I'm excited to talk to her about that. In terms of continuing the conversation, I mean, there's a great thing here with Eval Cafe that, bring somebody on to talk about this type of stuff. I'm on Twitter. Here's my Twitter handle. You can also just message me or email me. I'm usually pretty responsive and I love to chat with folks. Come on the podcast and let's just have a conversation. It's very low key. I like to have fun with it. And I'm looking forward to my book as well, our book as well. Once it's done, it's going to be a fun one. I'm having a lot of fun like writing it so far. Which I can imagine you had fun writing yours, Shari. Any more questions? Any thoughts?
This has been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Dana. I really appreciated your presentation and yeah, just the fielding of all our questions. So excited for the work you've done and the work you'll continue to do. So we'll admire it from afar and hopefully continue to look for opportunities to collaborate.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. Yeah, I love hearing about all the work that's happening at Western Michigan as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing stuff come out of the woodwork. Thank you all for being here today. I'm glad you were here and helped make a lively conversation at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Wanzer, and thank you all for your participation. Stay tuned for the follow-up email and the recording of this speaker series. Please be sure to join us for our next Eval Cafe, where we'll be having Dr. Michael Hanna. He's the assistant professor and also the interim director of interdisciplinary Ph.D. program here at the Western Michigan University. He'll be speaking on meta evaluation and also his work on railroad evaluation. So thank you very much and have a nice day.